All right. Well, again, good morning. I'm Tatia Davenport, CASBO CEO, and I am just so honored today to be joined by Kevin Gordon, President of Capital Advisor Group, and Namita Brown from F3 Law, talking about these March notices and really helping us understand with the looming budget deficit and the legal obligations to issue these layoff notices ahead of our final budget, how can our districts effectively balance this fiscal responsibility with also maintaining the high quality and support of our students? So that's going to be the essence of our conversation today. A few housekeeping items before I turn it over to Kevin and Namita. We are recording this session. It will be posted later this afternoon on our YouTube channel and also going out in a news break tomorrow. And so again, the session is being recorded. We're taking questions in Q&A. That allows us to make sure that we've captured and answered all of the questions you might have. We will be taking incremental breaks throughout the session to make sure that we do get those questions answered. So please don't leave any on the table. There's a lot of information for you today, and it's important that you're able and comfortable and confident taking this back to your district to make the best decisions on this topic. So Q&A is your place to answer those questions. And with those logistics out of the way, welcome Kevin and Namita.
Great. Tasha,
Hi.
thanks so much for doing this. Namita, thanks for joining us. I always like to say we don't want to try to pretend we're talking about these big issues and pretend we're lawyers. We need real lawyers. So Namita, you're going to be really important to this conversation. I wanted to just quickly go over kind of what we want to talk about, and then Namita and I will both get into this. So Tasha, thank you for doing the first bullet on welcome and introductions. And then what we wanted to talk about is sort of the why question, which is a really good place to start because our labor partners, people in the community are going to wonder why this conversation is going on to begin with. And then part of that gets answered in the next bullet, which is we got to give you guys the latest update as of just stuff that we just got yesterday. Tasha might chime in a little bit on this after I make some opening comments about what has changed with regard to the legislative analyst fiscal outlook and what was released yesterday. We're going to have more detail even later today on this. And then the local fiscal variables, never mind what's happening at the state level or the potential cuts there, but what are those underlying variables at the local level that are making us have to have sometimes these conversations that exist. And Namita jumping into more substantively, what does actually the law say? What are some of the nuanced changes that we've seen in law over the last couple of years that we have to keep in mind? I'll definitely have some opinions on this, but again, not the lawyer in the room. And then finally, a conversation about the different kinds of circumstances that every district finds themselves in, because a conversation about March layoff is not an easy conversation, and it has to really be understood, hopefully in a collaborative way between labor and management about why, if you guys are entertaining this, why you would go there. So that's kind of the rack up of what we're going to go into, and I'll start off right away with the why. So we can take this little agenda off the screen and I can get into this conversation. So one of the first things that I've said, and Tasha and I were talking about this really recently, just a week or so ago, and she said, you know, we had to do a webinar on this because we were having this conversation about that why question. And there's a couple of things going on. Aren't we talking statewide, or haven't we been talking statewide about a staffing shortage? Haven't we had those conversations? How do you pair that with regard to the idea of some kind of a fiscal crisis? And you've got those kinds of things going on. And then the other issue that I always say that our labor partners should and would be expected to say to any district that's talking about doing layoffs, what part of a no-cut budget proposal by this governor do you not understand that they would pose to district management? And so the answers lie in a lot of what we're going to be talking about later. And again, you know, we totally respect the idea that, you know, working with our labor partners, that when they hear us start talking about March layoff, they get jumpy in many districts. You you can create tension that lasts well beyond this budget cycle, and you have to think about the consequences of having the conversation. That said, what I want to try to point out is that these provisions in law regarding the March layoff statutes were put there by our labor partners. The teachers unions and classified unions more recently, we'll talk about that in a minute, have added these to the statutes because they want to have an earlier notice if in fact there's contemplation of the idea of layoffs, so that their members can be thinking about what they might want to do for next fall. And as you guys know, if you don't exercise this authority that you have, unless very unusual circumstances happen, it tends to mean that you cannot do layoffs at any point in the future after that. And Namita, I'll let you get into the details of it. But what I'm getting at is that if our labor partners are the ones that put this into statute for a reason, you're utilizing this as what I call an early warning, because it isn't the actual layoff, it's a layoff notice, is something that people should reasonably expect you to do. Otherwise, we would welcome in a heartbeat the efforts by labor and management to work together to move this date to a time when we have some idea about what we're actually going to have in terms of revenue. We know that we're way off of a May revision, and we're way off the final adoption of the budget. So the notion of having to do layoffs, which I think is terribly unfair to employees, it shouldn't be in the law. I think it should be way later, but it's there. And if it is there and it's your only way to deal with a people-intensive business, if in fact the legislature was to hand you budget cuts in a final budget, you don't have a whole lot of recourse. So I wanted to sort of talk a little bit about the why, invite you, Tasha and Namita, if you had any things to add to the why introduction to this topic. Happy to hear that.
I think you've summarized it beautifully, Kevin. Bottom line is every district is balancing the need for having a robust workforce and adopting a balanced budget. And the other place where this is getting triggered is you've got a lot of districts that are engaging in bargaining and coming up with bigger settlements that may not be affordable. And so there are issues that are coming up in many districts where the County Office of Ed wants a balanced budget, and therefore there is a push to make or adopt a resolution with cuts. So it's just not always, layoff driven because of the COLA. It's also because of the big negotiated agreements that are happening locally at various districts.
Right. Yep. And then I might also add this issue about the so-called staffing crisis we know is real, is that actually is going to actually make things easier for some districts that might not otherwise be going to exercise a March layoff, where they can in fact handle some of this challenge by virtue of attrition. So some of it does get helped by that, but in a lot of places it's just not enough. So that's the why. So let's jump into kind of the latest news with regard to the budget. And you've seen CASBO's excellent analysis of what's going on with regard to the governor's January budget proposal and the succeeding information that you've gotten from us and CASBO on what the legislative analyst's initial opinions were as early as last week. But the latest thing that just broke was both on Friday and yesterday, the legislative analyst revised basically their take on the overall budget situation. As you might recall, going all the way back to December, very early December, just on the heels of the CBO symposium that was held, the legislative analyst characterized the size of the overall problem as being a $68 billion problem, which the governor took a great deal of exception to. And it's because of the way they both calibrate what is both the revenue shortfall as well as what is the statutory components of issues that that you have to deal with in terms of defining what the overall problem is. And they came up with this number. The governor called it a $38 billion problem instead of a $68 billion problem, only a $30 billion difference. No big deal, right? Well, the legislative analysts yesterday recalibrated their number to be what they project to be a $73 billion problem. And that's just mostly because of the results of revenue that did not materialize in January they would have otherwise anticipated in budget assumptions. And that is the governor's own January 10th budget is what it's being compared to, that for the month of January, later in that month, the amount of money that came in for very rich people who file their quarterly taxes, as well as withholdings, came in dramatically lower than was anticipated, even in that governor's January budget plan. And the LAO points that out, so that they're now about $5.9 billion worse off than what everybody sort of assessed this as before. I think the governor will still insist that the definition of the problem might include that $5.9 billion, but as an overall figure, I think he's still going to remain many billions of dollars in a different opinion than where the legislative analyst is. And most of that difference is in the form of more optimism on the governor's part about what happens for the remainder of this year and also into the next fiscal year. But when you have a number of that magnitude, despite the fact that you got a governor saying that he wants to pursue a no cuts budget to education, you have to sit up and take notice, is that this is not going to be an easy budget to resolve. The solutions the governor's put on the table for education are complicated. Frankly, even the education community is still sort of wrestling with the details of that proposal. What we want to do is love the governor's notion of an effort to try to hold us harmless, but sort of have some fights, a little bit of fights about exactly how he accomplishes it. I will tell you this, that based on what was put on the table last Friday by the legislative analyst in passages of their report, it indicates some things in there that mark a very different turn for the legislative analyst than what we saw initially in January. Remember that the LAO came at this from the standpoint similar to the governor, but a little bit different, where they said, we think you need to do some cuts. The way they handled the drop in the guarantee that they estimate is happening over the budget forecast period is different than the governor, but they do call for cuts. And they got much more aggressive in the stuff that was put out last week by saying they believe we should be foregoing a cost of living adjustment. You know, I understand where they're coming from. If the rest of the budget's getting decimated, you got a problem of this dimension. I get it. But the administration wants to stay true to what we call a baseline budget, which would include a COLA. And if you're going to have a debate about the COLA, whether it's in or out, it's a great year to have it since it's so small, a 0.76% COLA. If we have to forego it, if I had to forego a COLA in any year, this would be the year to not have it. But we got to not negotiate with ourselves. I think standing strong with the governor on the idea of let's not diminish these really important investments we made in education is going to be a very, very important part of the fight. CASBO and CASBO members are going to be a really important part of that messaging. So the other things that are in the LAO's report that are disturbing is for the very first time, instead of saying we've got to try to protect all ongoing permanent investments, they reopened that door. And they basically said, look, we really do need to look at some of these bigger, longer term investments that are made to see whether or not we need to prune some of that back. There's been a lot of anxiety across the state. We saw it during our budget workshops about ELOP. We have predicted over and over again that we thought there isn't the political traction to reopen that. The legislative analyst sort of opens that door. And most concerning to me, and I don't know if you caught this, Tasha, but it was a little alarming to me the way it was written. We'll get clarification on it today. When they made reference to the fact they thought it was time to reopen a conversation about what they call add-ons in school finance, that they think are archaic programs that existed long ago that we built into school finances, add-ons that they're saying could potentially be phased out or eliminated. because they say it contributes to a disequity in funding statewide. What they're talking about, I believe, the only reference to add-ons that we know in school finance that we commonly refer to are those add-ons that are critical to the building blocks of LCFF that become base funding for school districts, like, for instance, the grade span adjustments we have in the early grades that were tied to class size reduction, and the grade span adjustment in the middle grades that were tied to career tech education. I'm sorry, 9 through 12, that are career tech education, and then transportation. If they mess with any of those three or all of them, they're messing with base funding that school districts will rely on. And that is a really big departure from where the LAO has been before, which is kind of do no harm. Let's just first make sure that we're capturing money that hasn't gone out the door yet. Let's make sure we're not clawing back actual money from LEAs. Everything where they're headed now is decidedly different. And I understand the reason probably is motivated by a larger definition of the problem. And so I think they need to go there. So what we've got framed up here is a debate between a proposal by the governor and legislative analyst alternatives that might make some fiscal sense, but are definitely less attractive to us in very big ways than where the governor is headed. So I just kind of wanted to frame that up, that you're going to now see a shift by statewide education leaders much closer to the governor than the legislative analyst, as the legislative analyst starts moving in a direction that would actually require cuts, probably in the current year as well as the budget year. So that feeds this conversation, extremely relevant to why we're talking about March, because you do not know what will end up being in that May revision, and what's your fiduciary obligation to your communities and to the kids you serve is to make sure you have every fiscal option available to you as you try to balance the budget in the coming year. So I thought I would hit that. See if, Tasha, you have any comments. I know you guys are cranking away on all this budget stuff as well.
Well, I appreciate your acknowledgement that we tend to be getting more information, more transparency around what are the options, at least on the table right now. And as you know, Kevin, we're always going to be looking to put more into the base and let the local decisions be made for where and how that money is used. But again, and the sustainability, right? And so when the door is open to at least look at, and we understand the political ramifications of, for example, ELOP, when the door is open for us to look at that with the mindset of understanding the political ramifications, right? That's important consideration, but also in many of our districts, there is no engagement in that program. So if we can use that, as a tool to help us through that, I think, again, there are just more transparency, more options on the table. We heard, or we saw an LAO report, right? Some of the grants that they're recommending get a second look. And also yesterday in our webinar, which should be posted already today, it will be on our YouTube channel. We heard the first conversation of deferrals and the potential reality of those coming. But, I think that the challenge for us right now is we have a lot of tools in place that we have thoughtfully built over the past few years, in the reserves. And how do we balance the preparedness that we have in place with these pretty extraordinary numbers in terms of the gap, and not overreact? I think that's how do we not overreact and give really thoughtful consideration to the options ahead of us. But we're going to have to do this collectively in the management organizations. We cannot have the school boards going one way and the superintendents another, right? We really need to come together and ask the state, I think, to be as transparent as possible. I mentioned in yesterday's conversation, we've got districts and our CBOs and our superintendents that are put in this position of having to share at the local level the budget, the budget implications. And this is a statewide issue. So it kind of sets everyone up for this defense at the local level. We really want the state to come out and educate on, here's the real crisis, if you will, in our state right now, and take that pressure off of the local management teams, and you know, get them out of that situation of having to fight these, you know, these conversations one at a time. This is a collective issue. Namita, what are your thoughts?
Yeah, I think what you are talking about are the conversations that need to happen at the local level, that needs to be part of when you are talking with your community around LCAP. I mean, this budget piece has to be part of that, but the problem is we are today on the 21st of February, and the timelines to make cuts is prior to March 15th. And so if the education of the community hasn't happened, you are going to, as a school board, you have to start looking at how do you talk about cuts in an open session of a board meeting. It's also problematic because CBOs and business services departments are running numbers all the time, and they are giving options to senior management, whether it's the extended cabinet, full cabinet, but somebody needs to make the decision to pull the trigger to actually take a resolution to the board. And that becomes a very problematic issue. And you've got to devote some time, because it's not just about whether you're cutting certain multiple subject classrooms, right? It's also about whether or not there is sufficient enrollment in your AP French. Are you going to get rid of your electives that are out there? I mean, it's a very detailed process. And considering the fact that we are coming up to March 15th, there's a lot of work to be done. And the other piece that I want to just put out there, the March 15th timeline in the code is a trigger. It's not the final layoff notice. That happens in May 15th. So the March 15th timeline is to give people notice, and all of that stuff can be rescinded prior to May 15th. But, you know, it's a lot of uncertainty. There's a lot of angst. And as you both talked about, this labor market where you can't find enough credentialed teachers, how do you make that argument and then do cuts? It's you know, you talk about programmatic cuts. Well, programs are people, and these are people who have served our kids, our community, and it's hard to make that cut, because you know what? Johnny's mom does not care about the budget. Johnny's mom cares about Johnny's teacher, and that is part of the difficulty that districts have to sort of figure out and communicate around.
Super.
Well, you know, we also know we've got, you know, in the CBO realms, we have 20% of our CBOs that are new. So they're going through this for the first time. And again, trying to rationalize, we've had this labor shortage, and we will be issuing most likely some of these notices. And I think it just creates a head scratcher for the community when we know we're in that situation. But for those new folks out here, I want to get a couple questions answered. Are charter schools subject to the March deadline?
Generally speaking, depends on what kind of a charter it is. So if this is where you've got teachers on leave from the regular school that are working in charter schools, there might be things in the agreement and the collective bargaining agreement where they've taken leave from their regular position. So there are ways to adjust that without impacting teachers who may have a special skill set who are at the charter school. So I think there are many local documents that you have to consult, but if you're an independent charter, there is no exception for this.
Yeah. So was there any other questions right there, Tasha, that you see? Okay. So one of the things I wanted to jump into as well is this issue that even though it's rather stressful thinking about some of the options that are now being put on the table that we're going to be talking about with regard to cuts, I do want you guys to know that, and CASBO is really helping to lead the fight on this, which is that when we do have difficult areas where there's sort of pain points coming, we do take advantage of the opportunity to start talking about flexibility. So to the degree that we're going to need some flexibility, if we need it at some point, you're going to have a really good messenger and giving voice to these issues in CASBO. And obviously we will be doing the same thing, and as well as the law firms like F3 and Atkinson Anderson and others, they're involved with this, giving voice to a lot of those things. So, but I just wanted to touch real quickly on the ELOP issue again, to say that we've had a lot of districts that say, look, we haven't had the capacity to do full implementation because of staffing issues. And we would love the legislature to give us flexibility with that money that we have instead of having to send it back. Believe me, their first order of business will be to capture that money for their own purposes, not to give you flexibility. Now, we'll talk about that issue, but the chances that they would let what would potentially be hundreds of millions of dollars sit in school districts for your flexibility rather than helping to create cuts that balance their overall, challenges that they have with regard to funding is probably unlikely. But I wanted to make sure I threw that because I've heard that from a lot of CBOs. They would love to have more flexibility with that ELOP money. But I also want to say that never mind what's going on at the state level, pretend that you don't get cut a penny. We have very serious underlying fiscal stress in school districts without reference to that. And it's a combination of a very anemic COLA, the fact that we have declining enrollment in a huge number of districts, and in many places, it's very, very serious. It adds up to a very serious fiscal problem for school districts. We have the continuing encroachment and issues regarding special ed. We've got the lack of funding and support by the state to help us with Thurs and PERS obligation. The PERS increase by itself this coming year will be more than the COLA they're contemplating giving us. So they don't give us a COLA, it adds insult to injury when you think about the lack of support we're getting on helping with those new obligations, unfunded mandates with regard to pension payments. And then there's insurance, and then there's both health insurance and liability insurance, and then there's utilities. But there's many things that I haven't mentioned. What that all points to is fiscal stress that may lead a district to talking about March layoffs that have nothing to do with the unpredictability of what the state may or may not do. That just makes it potentially a whole lot worse. But they've got situations right now that they have to consider. And I wanted to make sure everybody understood that even if, that whole adage, what about a no-cut budget by the governor? Do you not understand? Well, guess what? There's a lot of fiscal instability in districts where they need to be considering, moves like this relative to March. And then we turn really to the law, and that is understanding what does the law actually provide? What is the purpose of this as we know it in statute? Namita, I'll just let you turn you loose. I do want to mention that this will be the first time I think a lot of districts would actually be utilizing the classified side of this now that's new, only barely 2 years old, the part that applies to classified units. So how does that all work for us, Namita?
Okay, well, this is the exciting part now. So first of all, we all talk about March 15th. Please remember, the statute talks about giving notice prior to March 15th. So really, you should be planning for March 14th. So let's talk about certificated, then we'll talk about classified. So under the certificated scheme, you've got a couple of options. You've got the ability to reduce particular kinds of service. And what that means is maybe you don't need five PE instructors in your school district. Maybe you can finesse and make their working conditions such that you can get away with 4 FTE of PE, single subject PE instructors. So you can reduce that particular kind of service. So that is a model that is available where there is more discretion to the board based upon actual enrollments in class, based upon what the kindergarten incoming class looks like, to figure out where they can move people around without having to hire more people, or maybe go into the next school year with less people than you currently have. So that is called a PKS layoff. Again, has to be adopted by the governing board prior to March 15th. So you've got perhaps the last board meeting in February and the first board meeting in March to make that resolution happen. You've got to also adopt what is called a tie-breaking resolution, right? So we all know first day of school, that's when all your new teachers start in the district. Maybe they start 2 days ahead. So how are you going to distinguish between two people with the same first date and probationary status? So that is a resolution that goes to the board as well. And again, this is not a zero-sum game. In terms of every district, this is something that you have to work with your board with around what your priorities are. You've got to work with your labor partners depending on what the environment in your community is like, whether you need teachers with BCLAT authorizations, whether you need teachers with a certain kind of expertise to serve the kids in your community. So that is the tie-breaking resolution that also goes to the board. And once the board votes on that, you can then figure out who are the least senior teachers in your district in the areas that the board wants to make cuts in, and you notify them prior to March 15th. So again, our timeline is 8 days in March right now. And if you look at 14, that's another 14 days, 8 and 14, it's 22 days. It's not a whole lot of time. So that's something to be cognizant of. So that allows the board to have a bigger pool of how many teachers or how many FTE of certificated employees they want to cut, the PKS kind of layoff, right? You may only need 5, but perhaps the board decides, you know what, maybe we need to cut 6 FTE. Up to the board, their discretion. But one of the things that both Tatia and Kevin talked about was around flexibility. Don't automatically go to the layoffs. Make sure your attrition can be taken care of. Make sure that you have actually cleaned up your position control. I mean, many districts have positions that are unoccupied that you are still allocating funds to in your certificated or classified line item in your budget. So make sure all of that stuff is taken care of. But if you get to the place PKS or particular kinds of service resolution is adopted by the board, people are notified prior to March 15th. They are given an opportunity to request a hearing within 7 days, and it happens before the Office of Administrative Hearings. A judge is then dispatched to your district, and the hearing is held, and the judge issues a decision. The judge will issue a decision by statutorily. They're required to issue a decision by May 7th. And then you have to notify the teachers, and I'm talking only certificated at this point, and this may be teachers, administrators, or whatever. Certificated folks have to be notified that this is the decision that the judge has rendered, and then the board adopts the decision, modifies it, or rescinds it, and moves forward with the layoff if they need to, or they can rescind the whole thing. And then people have to be notified by May 15th that their services for the following year is not going to be required. So it's not a process that is done in isolation. There's a lot of overlap between human resources and the CBOs. And frankly, you guys have to help a lot, because a lot of the system that determines payroll, that determines what is the first date and paid probationary status, is manned by the business office. So just be aware of that. In the Ed Code, there is also another provision, and that is for what is called an ADA-based layoff for certificated staff. And this is a very narrow time frame. It says between the 5 days after the enactment of the annual budget and August 15th, to which the annual budget of the year to which the annual budget applies. If you feel that your ADA has not increased by 2%, or the increase in the budget hasn't led to a 2% increase, you can do what is called an ADA-based reduction. Now, this is very mathematical. It's a formula-based determination of what an FTE looks like. So there is less board conversation around what are going to be the particular areas of cuts that you're going to make. You're going to go straight up from the bottom of the seniority list to figure out who needs to go, because it's a straight seniority-based cut, not driven by services. And if you are any district, like all the districts I work with, the most junior people generally are special ed teachers. And that presents another challenging conundrum. I mean, you've got to provide a mandated service of special ed. How are you going to lay off special ed teachers? So those are the two. Just remember that the PKS, or the particular kinds of service, allows you to have more discretion. It gives districts more discretion. It can be narrowly tailored to your district. But if you miss the March 15th timeline for that short time period, based upon the number of what, we are getting a 0.76% COLA at this point. Yes, many districts will be able to say that they did not meet the 2% threshold, but it's a very specific formula-based approach that may not be well suited. So please contemplate that, work with your counsel. That is one thing that you need to be aware of. So that's why we generally refer to certificated layoffs from a March 15th lens. On the classified side, a couple of years ago, CSEA demanded parity with certificated staff. And remember the old days where you could get rid of classified employees for lack of work or lack of funds, make these reductions based upon programmatic needs, and you could just give them 60 days notice and it was done. That statute has been modified to provide a scheme that is parallel to the certificated scheme. So there is March 15th notification. There is a hearing process if an employee requests a hearing. There is a hearing notice that is given, and then there is the adoption and final notification by May 15. Those are parallel. Now, the caveat here is if you've got classified employees who are funded from specially funded programs or categorical monies, just remember that you don't need to comply with the March 15th timeline. You can give them notice once the specially funded programs, the funding is going away. That's when you give them notice. But in my experience, a lot of districts use every pot of money to pay for a position. And so it's very hard to make a straight face argument that this particular categorical position is funded by special pots of money or restricted money. So you've got to plan for all of that. And, again, classified gets even more complicated because for the certificated employees, there is a statutory scheme. For classified, the statutory scheme has not caught up with the certificated state. So you are complying with the March 15th timeline notice, but you have to be really watching and observing what is in your collective bargaining agreement. So those are a little bit of things to think of. Couple of things that I want to point out. You cannot do layoffs if you have not released what are called temporary teachers in your district. So make sure you do an audit, release your temporary teachers before you start noticing probationary folks for layoff purposes. Also make sure that you have done the right thing in terms of classification. And these are pretty complicated topics that take a lot of time, take a lot of audit and analysis. So if this is not perhaps something that the business office will do, but if the business office is really relying upon making cuts, you need to partner with your human resources office to make sure that all the classifications are right, because you can notice the right people, but if the classification that you had given them or they had been given under the HR analysis is wrong, then OAH or the Office of Administrative Hearings is not going to allow you to proceed with that layoff. And so you would incur the cost of a hearing and that layoff notice will be rescinded. Okay, so you're not going to realize a savings. In fact, you're then just going to be out of pocket for the money that you spent on a hearing. The other thing, there was a few years ago, a district in the Bay Area, small district, they could not figure out who needed to be noticed, how they needed to be noticed. So they sent notices to all their teachers. That layoff was invalidated. So just be mindful of that. The other thing that I want you to also think about, many of you are going out for parcel taxes, and many of your parcel taxes are tied directly to recruiting and retaining teachers. So, March 5th is your special election, and on March 6th or 7th, you're going to take it to a special board meeting that you are laying off teachers. I mean, the optics. So these are all things to think through. It's not a universally applicable analysis to every district. Every district is different, but I think what is universally applicable is the March 15th date and the notice of final layoff by May 15th. So those are the two pieces statutorily that you have to be aware of. And Also, make sure you have a contract with the Office of Administrative Hearings. So try to schedule that ahead of time as well, because that is a responsibility that solely comes back with the business office. That is not handled by human resources. So those are probably the big statutory schemes and processes for layoffs. And I'm happy to take any other questions on this particular issue.
Right.
Namita, thank you. My goodness, we do have a question that's asking, is this related at all to the probationary non-reelect? Can you release a problem employee without the March deadline?
Really good question. So you can release a probationary employee prior to March 15th of their second probationary year. So if they're a true probe 1, they can be non-reelected till June 30th of their probe 1 year. But if they are a probe 2, March 15th of their second year. But I must caution you, there is a specific case called Cousins versus Weaverville that says you cannot non-reelect an employee in lieu of layoff. If you're doing a layoff, you should not be non-reelecting an employee to just save the money of a layoff. If really it's about layoff, you need to do a layoff. If they're really a subpar employee and you don't want them to be a permanent employee of the district, do a non-reelect, but don't do a non-reelect in lieu of a layoff. That is illegal.
Super good. And one of the things you covered, Namita, was one of the things that I wanted to end with, which is this: every district is different. And I think you really laid out a couple scenarios where this is not the greatest option. But the other thing I started with at the very beginning was to say, and Tasha, you really touched on it, the fight that we're about to engage in this year over the fundamental condition of school investment in this state is one that's going to engage labor and management together. We are going to have to work very closely with our labor partners. The idea of doing anything that's sort of statewide in nature to talk about everybody should go out there and do what you can to utilize the March 15th layoff date is not in the spirit of trying to work together. So what we want to try to encourage is that you have these conversations in collaboration with your labor partners, super important, because we are going to be fighting shoulder to shoulder with our labor partners to try to protect against education cuts so that we don't end up having to see layoffs occur if we can avoid that. So I wanted to mention that. And then what I had said earlier, which is that the ramifications of really serious labor stress in a district lives well beyond just that fiscal year and can really break apart relationships that are going to be fundamental to delivering for our kids. So you always have to consider all these things in context. But I think we've given you some information here that are really helpful for you to raise in that public debate when you have it. One is that the March date itself, as totally not logical as it is, was not put there by management, but put there, in fact, by our labor partners. To move it, which we would love to move it to July sometime when we have an idea of what we actually have in our budget, is a problem. I get it to employees because they want to have a better idea in advance of what the prospects of having that job in the fall is. So it's a tough, not simple issue. And we get that. So we're going to have to try to work together as much as we can. And with that, I'll turn it back over.
Well, and Kevin, I mean, you just really hit the nail on the head. We've been talking about, well-being of our employees, their wellness, and then we have this statutory process that certainly escalates the stress level and probably declines productivity for the foreseeable future. All a challenge for education. Namita, and then we will go to some questions.
Okay, just one last caveat here. If you're planning for the next year, and if there is a way that you can work with your labor partners to offer some kind of an early notification of retirement incentive, and it could be, districts do it, $500, $2,000, whatever works in your district, in your culture, to get to a place where you don't have to do layoffs. I mean, utilize and pull every option that is out there to make it work.
So a few questions. We're getting confirmation. Did I hear Namita correctly? If a classified employee is funded with restricted dollars, then the March 15th deadline does not apply?
So I should say categorical monies. Yes, that is correct.
Thank you. It seems like staffing has remained relatively flat as we've had significant declines in ADA, but districts have been hesitant to right size their staff. Thoughts or comments on that?
Yeah, and I think part of that is by the fact that even the COVID dollars don't ultimately shut off till September of this year. And so we know that there are a number of districts there carrying a very
Large.
healthy ratio of adults to pupils. I honestly think that's what we ought to have for all schools and ought to be permanent. But there's great things with declining enrollment. The one positive thing is if we could keep the money that we had before the students declined, we would increase per pupil funding to a place that would actually potentially be admirable. That's what we ought to be doing, and we ought to be increasing the adult to pupil ratio, not cutting it. But what you're making a really good point. There are thresholds of employees to students that are higher than we've ever had them, and there has not been that effort to go back and take a look at that. Again, they're positions, right? People want to be sensitive to that. But I think the fiscal contraction is going to demand that we take a closer look at that. You're absolutely right. I was just at a board meeting where they showed the board what those ratios looked like in terms of overall staffing, and they were, crazy high levels. But again, we were provided the money to do that. Now we've got to sort of get real about what our resources are and what our staffing levels need to be.
And if I may just add, I mean, one of the other things that many districts are grappling with because of these one-time monies is that they have a large ending fund balance. And when you have an ending fund balance that is significant in millions and you want to make cuts, you have to be prepared for community and, staff, labor partners come out and say, why are you cutting this when you are carrying a $1 million carryover to the next year? And really, again, the bottom line is the notion, and I do a lot of collective bargaining. So the notion that you can explain to people that this is not ongoing monies, it's one-time monies. Nobody cares. So you've got to be mindful, and that's why the collective partnership of labor and management is so essential, so that people can figure out ways to best use the money.
The example of that, Namita, is the Learning Recovery Block Grant money, is it's allocated to be spent all the way into the 27-28 fiscal year. They want you to hang on to it and use it over that period of time. Well, they don't expect you to blow it all in 1 year. So you're sitting on money that's very tied to actual specific outcomes or purposes, and it's in your fund balance, and they're scratching their head about why you have that. That happened a lot over the last couple of years with the huge direction of money from the legislature that had strings attached to it. People sort of interpret it as, hey, what's with all this money you're sitting on? Well, it's for a specific purpose. And if you don't use it, frankly, for some of these purposes, TK and ELOP and other, you actually have to send that back. So it really is true that people don't get into the nuances of why those fund balances are quite that big.
Couple easy ones here. We mentioned the grants that are being looked at for potential cuts. I've asked Veronica to post the LAO report. We talked about that yesterday. If you go back again to our YouTube channel, you will hear Ken Capone going through that in detail yesterday. Very enlightening conversation. So you'll find that there. There's a question, I understand the March date for peace of mind. Is there a substantial change? If a substantial change in the budget, LCFF changes, COLA and the like, is there a method for opening a new window? I think this is, correct me if I'm wrong, but it would take a new law, right, to update. Yeah. So that's a lengthy process.
Well, and I'll tell you right now, they're in the very first budget subcommittee in both houses. And I don't know that it was coordinated, but the chairman of the Senate Budget Subcommittee for Education and the chair of the Assembly Budget Subcommittee over in the opposite house, in their first hearings, separate rooms, separate days, raised the issue of this 2% issue with regard to what ends up adjusting the LCFF upward. Many of you know that there's law that says when you get a COLA that is under 2%, it typically triggers another opportunity for layoffs. We call the summer layoff. And there's major conversation about how do we take that 0.76% and augment it, increase it, so it gets to 2% or higher. And I'm scratching my head is like, don't we have a budget crisis? That costs you another $1.3 billion. Where does that come from? I'm all for it. If they hold us harmless and they want to give us a 2% COLA, let's go for it. But it just tells you that they're contemplating this impact on our labor partners. And to the degree that they want to mitigate it, they might. But also the strength of our labor partners in the legislative process to probably preclude an invented new opening, even though it might actually make really good policy sense.
Perhaps that should have been one of the proposals in the 2,100 plus bills that were introduced last week, right? The final deadline. Sorry.
No. I just wanted to piggyback on what Kevin just said and note that the 2% threshold that he's talking about is the ADA layoffs that happen during the summer.
Right.
So just make sure that we are speaking the same thing.
That they're related, yeah. And so to the degree the legislature gives us more money, they will shut off that opportunity.
And you know what? I've done this for over 20 years. There have been very few windows where I don't recall, maybe just one window over the 20-year period where there was an opportunity for summer layoffs. But as soon as boards realize that they're touching probably in terms of notice really critical needs teachers, they backpedal and they say, no, we don't want to lose our speech and language pathologists. We don't want to lose our newest psychologists. And so they just backpedal.
And Namita, that ADA process, since we've lined up our understanding of that, can we also lay off classified staff under that process?
No, there is no classified there is no corresponding classified process for ADA-based reductions.
Thank you. So I'm going to just kind of think around what we've heard today, you know, a tremendous level of analysis from our CBOs on, you know, your local situation and collaborative working with HR on position control. That seems to be really critical right now. You introduced the ADA reduction. I think that was probably new for some of our folks, right, that have been in the job for not that long. The collective bargaining agreements, revisiting those and making sure that you're very clear on what is involved in those. And again, just that deep level of analysis and collaboration. Anything else to synthesize that we've talked about today that are important takeaways for our audience?
I think we hit it. So.
Yeah, and I would just say, I mean, Kevin is the expert on the budget. I will just say from a practical operational perspective at the district, I think you've got to be really mindful at the table regarding the language that you put in. Don't put in language to buy labor peace right now, which is going to impede your ability to be flexible. And, you know, I must also say labor partners have been very good. You know, we saw that in COVID where people entered into MOUs to figure out different ways to use classifications and give additional flexibility to districts. So language in your collective bargaining matters and relationships matter.
We have a question around a template for a classified seniority list. We are going to point you to CASBO CBO community, where we will ask that we share some resources there. But in closing, just a couple of things. One, you are all supported by a network of very experienced professionals that will help support your district through this. That's the community that we have here at CASBO and certainly with our partners, Capital Advisors and F3. There was earlier question around how are we working together with AXA and CSBA. We're part of the Ed Coalition. Labor is also there. We're taking, you know, we're looking at the same data and really having really rich dialogues around what faces us ahead. And that includes all of the folks in the both labor management and labor. So with that, thank you, Namita, for bringing that level of experience and detail to the table. And Kevin, as always, your perspective is really valued in this. And we're appreciative of you being both a partner and being here today in this session.
Great. And thank you, Tasha, for the leadership CASBO is exercising, because you guys are totally front and center. It's great to see that. We love to see CASBO in a leading role on these budget issues. So appreciate your leadership.
Thank you all. Thanks for being here. Have a wonderful day.
Too. Thanks.